I'm joined by Ben Wander, the Wandering Ben, and we're going to be talking about A Case of Distrust. So, thank you for taking some time to talk with us, Ben.
Yeah, sure. This should be fun.
I'm interested to pick your brain about this. So before we dive into the game proper, why don't you give people a little pitch for the game if they haven't heard of it and don't know what it's about?
Sure. A Case of Distrust is a narrative mystery game that takes place in 1924 in San Francisco. You play Detective Phyllis Malone, and she's trying to solve a case of deceit and deception. So, gameplay wise, it's kind of a point and click adventure meets choose your own narrative. So, you're searching different locations for clues, you're finding clues, you're talking to people, and they give you statements, and some of those statements are false. People are lying to you.
What?
I know. So
How
based
dare
on
they?
what you've heard from other people and what you've found in the rooms, you have to call out the liars. And once you discover who's lying to you and why, it sort of progresses the mystery forward.
Awesome. That's a great overview of kind of all the elements.
Yeah, I've
Um,
practiced that a lot.
I can imagine. The first thing that I wanted to pick your brain about is kind of the noir genre in general. Because
Okay.
it's not something that comes up all too often. I mean, everybody probably has heard about LA Noir, that got enough press, but it's not something I see too often tackled in narrative games, which I find surprising because I think noir stories are incredibly fun and they're incredibly nostalgic and they grip you really quickly. So, how did you go about building noir, and why did you lean towards going the noir route?
Yeah, so I really like mysteries. I love mystery games. And in the same way that you don't think there's enough noir games, I would even expand that. There's not enough mystery games. There's not
Yeah.
enough detective games. And there have been plenty of articles like all over the web saying, why aren't there more detective games? So when I set out to make my own game, I kind of was wondering that too and decided to take a stab at it. It turns out they're hard to make for various reasons. But I think eventually I ended up with something pretty good. Um, I knew before working on it that I also wanted to make something in the 1920s because I love that era and that period. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and the 1920s in San Francisco has such a rich history and culture and tapestry. Uh, but unlike New York and Chicago and Atlantic City, it hasn't really been explored in popular media like the 1920s in California. Really,
Hmm.
overall, I mean the 40s and 50s a bit in LA Confidential and LA Noir, but if you go earlier than that, it's all about the East Coast mobsters, and nobody really talks about the
Hmm.
West Coast, which I found kind of weird. In terms of noir specifically, I really liked the old pulpy, hard-boiled fiction novels, and that's sort of where the noir inspiration comes from. Like that's where the 40s and 50s movies got their inspiration, and
Right.
so I kind of went back to that original well and went, okay, let's look at Philip Marlowe from the books. Let's look at Sam Spade and like all the Dashiell Hammett novels and things like that. So it was really about reading a ton of those,
Hmm.
finding patterns in those, finding patterns in mystery writing, and then kind of trying to adapt that to a video game. And the reason I alluded to earlier, but a big reason why that's hard is in a linear form of media, you always want the detective to be a step ahead of the audience or like half a
Hmm.
step ahead of the audience, right? And then the big reveal is the surprise at the end. It's the climax. It's the detective going, see, you should have seen this all the time, but you didn't.
Right.
In the game, you want the player to be half a step ahead of the story. They should be the ones saying, "Hey, here's the reveal." But if they're too far ahead, then the world seems dumb and naive. Then you go, well, why didn't this professional police officer, why wasn't he able to figure this out? So it's sort of you want to keep the story mysterious, but you also want to give the players that aha moment
Hmm.
before the plot itself figures it out. So that in itself is really interesting. You kind of have to break a few tropes to get there.
Hmm.
But I kept most of the mystery and most of the noir format kind of up until, okay, when does the detective solve this and how
Right.
does that work? Yeah.
Cool. That's interesting to hear about that balance and how hard that is to maintain with the player. Where instead of you watching, you're actually the one doing it. That's good. That's an interesting issue to deal with. Um, Now, I think that the main character Malone is a really
Yeah.
interesting character. I think it's cool that you've cast a woman in the lead of this story that was, dominated by men of the fiction of the time.
Yeah.
Um, But I don't want to talk about Malone. I want to talk about Frankie.
All right.
Because Frankie, I thought, was one of the most interesting characters in this game.
Okay.
For people that don't know, Frankie's a bartender that you can go to, and you can kind of mull your notes over with him. So I wanted to know how you kind of approached this narrative. Was it something that was always in the game? And why did you include this character that kind of you can use to help you solve the case? And in some places you have to use him.
Yeah. So actually, I don't think there's a moment in the game where you have to use him. Although there is someone gives him a call, and so like you have to talk to him for the call.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about in the first act.
Yeah, exactly. So the bartender was a really good character because I wanted somebody in the world that acted kind of as your confidant for the purposes of giving you, the player, hints without it seeming like, click the hint button and we'll give you the next line of the hint. So it's sort of, the game really encourages at the beginning of the game, like I overly point out to the player, hey, if you're ever stuck, just come chat with me. Maybe we can figure stuff out. It was interesting writing him because he can't, as a character, give Malone as a character the answers, or else again it seems like, well, why isn't this guy the detective if he knows everything, what's going on? So writing some of the hints was interesting of how Malone sort of, it clicks for her because he says something, so it's always it clicking for the detective. And those are the moments where the player and the player character diverge for a split second because she has to realize something, and then a split second later the player does. I was hoping, and I think I succeeded. I mean, I don't know. The players can tell me if I did or not. But in terms of adding in subtle enough hints that sort of build on top of each other, that if you go back and talk to Frankie more and more about the same stuff, that eventually you'll get it and unlock it. But I don't think there's that many people who go all the way through and keep talking to him. They sort of talk to him a couple times and then say, oh, okay, I get it, and they'll move on and they'll go figure out the rest of it for themselves.
That was my experience when I was playing through. I found in the beginning I was relying on him a little bit, and then once kind of got used to everything, I kind of went off on my own. But I was really impressed with how you built this hint system that in most games is very gamey.
I think it's important because the thing with every adventure game or every point and click game, every game where you're trying to solve something, you need to get into the mindset of the game designer, really. So often I'll find myself, whenever I play, like a WoD Jedi game and I haven't played it for a while, I'll get stuck really early on, and then I'll go to like a game facts and I'll look up, hey, how do I do this? And then think, wow, you can interact with that? I never even thought about doing that, So it takes a couple of solutions until you start seeing a pattern with the game, and that's, I think, what Frankie let me do, was more naturally, hopefully, give you a game facts of like, hey, this is kind of the type of problem you're gonna be solving in this. This is a pattern that you should watch out for, and then again, after like one or two times, players end up themselves going, oh no, I get it, and they get into that mindset.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly well done. The other thing that really stood out to me in A Case of Distrust was your use of color. I really loved how essentially you've almost color-coded the environment, the different players, and I wondered why you did that, and I wondered what kind of your mindset was in creating this world that way.
Right. So each color is important for every character. I put a lot of thought into, okay, what the most kind of tongue-in-cheek one is Mr. Green is green. So that was an easy one. But like, why is his name Mr. Green was more important. It's because, he was a mobster. He's greedy. There's like a lot of things about Mr. Green that make him green. He's envious of a lot of things. And so each character sort of is represented by their color in an interesting way. I also thought of these characters beyond just the story that you see them in. I thought
Sure.
of, okay, where did they grow up? What were their lives like? And then where are they going? Like after the mystery ends, what happens to them? And who are they as characters? And a lot of their color is based on the future as well. So
Mm.
it's kind of more of an overall narrative arc of trying to explore the characters themselves, and then you're only seeing a slice of them in this mystery.
I love that. That's cool. It adds depth to this story that you've told. Last thing I wanted to talk about specifically in terms of the game
Yeah.
was the taxi journeys,
Yeah.
which I thought were a really interesting addition to the game, where when you're traveling from place to place, you jump in a taxi cab and you have the choice of whether or not to be talkative, or whether or to just be silent and not talk with the taxi cabs. And there's some fantastic bits of dialogue and little stories hidden in those little vignettes of the taxi cabs. But quite honestly, you could miss them completely.
Yeah.
So why did you design those taxi journeys like that? And kind of what was your purpose in putting that into the game?
So my favorite part about historical fiction in general is the amount of history you can see just from having fun, just from enjoying yourself. But if I stuffed in a ton of facts and historical landmarks and everything in the main story, it would have felt overwhelming. It would have felt like, oh, you're reading a textbook and instead of solving a mystery. So I kind of use the taxi cab conversations as a way for you to get a slice of life in that world of how can you feel what the 1920s were like for just a regular 1920s guy or gal. The mystery itself is more to do with, okay, there were mobsters and there were speakeasies and there were bartenders and there were whatever. But, the taxi drivers will talk to you about sports or movies or politics or things that don't necessarily relate to the main plot, although you might see some themes woven throughout them. But kind of paint a more holistic picture of the world that you're playing in. And I thought that, narratively, that was important for me to do, although some people might not want that. And so it was important that I let my players seek that out. That if you want to learn more about this world, about this story, if you want to fill it in for yourself, that's completely your choice. You shouldn't be forced to do that. Especially this was important like late in the game where the mystery becomes really fast paced, like all the events kind of get this more quick cadence. And if somebody's really like in the middle of solving it, I want them to go, no, screw you. I don't want to talk to you, taxi driver, right now. I'm thinking, like, let's go. And so that was important to give the player that choice, to seek it out when they want to, but ignore it if they're focused on something else.
Yeah, that was exactly my experience. Is
Right.
At the beginning, I ended up, I kind of saw Malone as this kind of sullen, indrawn person. She wasn't going to talk to a taxi cab. I mean, what are you doing? And I would encourage people to at least talk to a few of them, because there's some really excellent bits of writing in there hidden behind those conversations. So turning from talking about A Case of Distrust specifically, I'd love to know kind of your story and how you got involved in independent game design.
Yeah, so I started as an intern at EA Mobile. That was like my first gig when I was 19 or something. And then I kind of bounced around the industry for a while. I ended up in AAA games. My first job was at Silicon Knights, the infamous creators of Too Human. And then after that, I bounced to BioWare, where I worked on Dragon Age Inquisition, and then over to Visceral Games, where I worked on Battlefield. And then after Battlefield Hardline was when I left Visceral and made the jump into indie. And I get asked sometimes, like, why did you leave AAA? And my honest answer is, I almost exclusively play indie games these days. They're just so interesting to me. They're so different and out there, and I don't just play narrative games. I play all sorts of games like Hollow Knight or, anything, kind of anything that comes on my radar. But most of the new, cool, interesting stuff ends up being indie. And I got into this industry to begin with because I liked making what I liked playing. And I realized that the more and more I was playing indie games, the more and more I wanted to make them. And so that was when I knew at the end of that game, okay, what is it I want to do next with my career? I want to go do make indie. I want to go make indie stuff. Go do make indie. That's how you know I've only had one coffee today. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's an awesome story. It's something we see echoed all the time, and that
Yeah.
passion that's in the indie community is infectious for sure. So then, I mean, you just mentioned Hollow Knight as kind of like a standout, but what were some of the other games that served as your inspiration, that kind of really triggered you wanting to make indie games?
Oh man. So obviously, narrative games play a huge part in it.
Sure.
Gone Home, when that came out, I remember thinking, "Holy crap! This thing is you can tell a different type of story with a game that I hadn't seen told before. You know, it was almost like a modern day Myst, but it all took place inside a suburban house, talking about a kind of a standard like slice of life high school story that just kind of hadn't been done in a game before, and that really kind of opened my mind up to other things. I remember a really cool game that I played was Sam Barlow's, oh crud, what's the name of that game? The one where you type in, you're like a detective, but you're working like at some terminal, and you type in different words into a search query. You know the one I'm talking about. Which the woman's doing the interviews, and she's talking.
What is that called? Man, we're both.
Anyway, whatever. So
I'll
like
put a screen in here. It's like, we're dumb. This is what I mean. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, all that stuff was wonderful, and then obviously even stuff like Bastion was really huge for me. When Bastion came out, I thought that was absolutely wonderful, and kind of everything Supergiant does is really amazing. On a slightly higher level, I'm a really big Double Fine fan. I mean, they're kind of triple I, or they're doing some bigger stuff in this space. But still, all of these games, man, and it was, you started seeing the kind of two paths of AAA is, more safe because it's trying to play to 10 million people. There was that story a few years back where it was Tomb Raider sold 4 million copies and Square Enix thought it was a failure. And I went, what? What are you talking about? Like, if my game sells 4 million copies, I'm retiring and buying a yacht or doing making games from the middle of the ocean. Like, what are you talking about? 4 million is a failure. So I don't know. That's kind of where I realized that, AAA was kind of spinning off into this, hey, we want to be really massive appeal. And indie was kind of spinning into, hey, because we don't have these giant budgets, we don't have these shareholders, we can do kind of more interesting stuff with this medium. And that excited the heck out of me. Yeah, absolutely. You're hitting all the points of exactly why we started Indie Hangover. So
nice. Perfect.
Complete agreement. So talking about the indie scene, we always like to ask developers we talk to what games they're excited for that are either in development or on the horizon of coming out. So are there any games you want to give a shout out to, or indie teams?
So the big thing that I'm excited about coming out is Jenny LeClue Detective Ooh. That's like the big, oh man, every time I see a new screenshot that Joe posts of that, I'm extremely excited. And yeah, I think did he release a bit of gameplay or something? I don't know, but I'm all over that.
There's been some demos around, so.
Yeah, exactly. Every show I go to where he's there, I like go and run up to him and be like, "Is there something new? I need to play this." So yeah, that game I'm super excited. In terms of indie games, like what's the next hot indie thing that I want to play? 100% that. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm glad you've mentioned that. We usually use these as a jumping off point, so I think I'll be getting in touch with Joe and pick his brain.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Ben, thank you for taking some time to talk to us about A Case of Distrust and kind of the design philosophy behind some of the elements of it. If you're interested in getting A Case of Distrust, we'll have links in the description below, so you can go and nab it. I encourage you to. Thanks again, and please keep us in the loop.
For sure. Thanks for the interview, man.